Good evening and welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery, here for our Friday evening monk chat, our regular program of questions and answers. And so during this time, if you have any questions related to Buddhism, related to meditation, related to monks, related to the Triple Gem, then we'll do the best of our ability to answer those, asking forgiveness in advance for my clumsiness and many faults. So I hope that the answers are helpful. And we have some people joining in live in the monastery, as well as people joining in live on the videos. And so I see already greetings from Joseph. I hope you're doing well, Joe. Wishing you well. And also Sean. Well, hello to Sean and Mariah. Cows are friends. Gregory, Bhumika, Moons Beans, Jody, and Chad, and anyone else who might be joining in live, who might be joining in after watching the recording. And so at this time, I will render homage to the Buddha. And after that, I will go ahead and start looking at the questions. And we will go either for as long as there are questions or until time stops us at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Sanghaṃ Saranahං Gacchāmi. Okay. So our first question is from Joe. It says, warmest wishes, venerables, and Dhamma friends. Bhante, when practicing... Okay, so he's asking, if someone is practicing according to the Dhamma Sutta, how can they skillfully investigate experience as either a faith follower or Dhamma follower to see clearly if we still hold any wrong belief or perception that these phenomena, such as our sense bases, objects, consciousness, contact, feeling, perception, intention, craving, elements, aggregates, are permanent, stable, or unchanging? And so he's asking, how can someone deepen their confidence and clarity towards stream entry using the advice of the sutta? Okay, well, so good question, Joe, and of course, always a important topic, looking into how can we, deepen our confidence and clarity, right? Very good way of putting it. So you're referring to a collection of suttas in the Samyutta Nikaya, 25:1 through 10, where the Buddha is talking about what is a Saddhanusari and what is a Dhammanusari and what is a Sotapanna. All right, so one thing that's important to mention is that in these suttas, the Buddha is, well, I should say, what do the suttas say? Well, they say, as you allude to, they say that people who have faith, who have confidence that the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and the mind, that the sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mental phenomena, that the consciousness, contact, feeling, perception, intention, craving, the elements and the aggregates, that all these things, people who have confidence, who have strong faith that they are not permanent, that they are impermanent, that they're not reliable, that they're unreliable, that they're not stable, that they're unstable, and that they're not persistent, that they're not unchanging, but that they are in fact changing, that they're impersistent. People have strong faith, strong confidence in that teaching. The Buddha says that some of those people are called Saddhanusaris. So they are what translates to faith followers. And then the people who have some degree of wisdom, some degree of what you say as clarity into that point. So they've investigated it with their wisdom. They've investigated it with their discernment. And rather than having a strong faith, but they have kind of ferreted out with their wisdom that those things are not permanent, not stable, not constant, not reliable, not dependable. The Buddha says some of those people are called Dhammanusaris, followers by the Dhamma. Right, so it's important to remember that these are not everyone. So in your question, you almost seem to be alluding to the idea that maybe everyone is one of these, but that's actually not the case, right? So these are very specific, special people who it's not just like you hear the teaching and you think, oh, that sounds, that seems right or something. Because later on in the sutta, of course, the Buddha says that the people who are faith followers and the people who are Dhamma followers, they will attain stream entry within their life, before they pass away. So that's not everyone, right? If it was that easy, it would be, we would be, samsara would end a lot in much less time, right? So it's not just kind of trusting the ideas, but it's actually a specific type of people who have strong faith to a degree that their mind is deeply settled on that point, or strong wisdom to the point that they are almost at the level of a breakthrough. So it's important to keep that in mind. Not everyone is going to be in that category. And so how can someone deepen their confidence and clarity towards stream entry? Well, of course, one thing would be to listen to those teachings and to contemplate them, right? So when the Buddha says, all these things, your whole experience, your life is impermanent, it's unstable, it's not dependable. Do you think, oh, that's interesting, that's a fun fact, that's cool, that's, seems like it probably true? Or do you really enwrap your mind around that theme? Do you really almost become obsessed over it? Like almost to a point of, a kind of distracting you from the rest of life, right? Because if you are, going to your 9-to-5 job and meditating 20 minutes in the morning, and you think that, things are impermanent, clearly the mind is not really that faithful that things are impermanent, right? Because if you have that much faith that these things are impermanent, well, you would lose your confidence in the world. So one thing to look at is like, one thing is to have faith in impermanence. The other thing is to say, well, what's the counterpart to that? The counterpart is faith in permanence, faith in dependability, faith in things being reliable. So then you look at behavior. So how does faith manifest? Faith manifests as behavior, right? And the Buddha talks about this in several suttas. He says, what's a sign of faith? One thing is generosity, one thing is virtue, etc. So there are different signs of faith. And so it's not a sign of faith in impermanence if someone is living their life as if, in fact, things were permanent, things were reliable, that there was a tomorrow, that they can depend on these things. So rather, someone who has very strong faith in the impermanence of their experience, the impermanence of their life, they will place all their confidence there, all their coins there, right? So imagine that you're playing some kind of poker or some kind of gambling game, right? Not recommended, of course, but imagine that you are. And if you are, and you really have a lot of faith, you hear a voice whisper in your ear and it says, place it on 10, place it on red 10, right? I don't really know how exactly it works, but I think that that's probably something that you can do.
It's roulette.
Yeah, roulette. So like a number and a color, right? And so you're thinking, you hear a voice and you really trust it. You have faith, like, yeah, that must be true. That's real voice. So what would you do with your coins? Would you place like, maybe I'll put, 5 on red 10 and the other 5 somewhere else and maybe 10 over here just in case? No, that would mean that you actually don't have faith. That would mean like maybe you have a little bit of faith, like, that's kind of interesting. You're not totally skeptical. You don't disregard it totally. But if you really had faith, you would put all your chips on red 10. You'd be willing to lose everything because you really trust that that's where the winning game is. So if you really have faith that everything is impermanent, that's where you put your chips, right? So, you're not going to be putting your chips kind of half here, half there, sort of Buddhism is interesting, things are impermanent, dude. But rather you're going to be really trusting that. Now, you don't necessarily see it, right? You're not necessarily that you have a breakthrough, but you trust it deeply. So you can look at your behavior and you can see, what is my behavior? And when you do, and you see that, your behavior is inclining actually towards, more than anything, inclining towards trusting, inclining towards permanence, inclining towards reliability, then you say, you question that. You say, whoa, what am I trusting? Where is my faith? Is that justified? Right? and you contemplate death. You contemplate change. You observe with mindfulness, you observe how things are constantly arising and ceasing. You contemplate the uncontrollable nature of your body and mind, how it's not ultimately in your control. You contemplate these types of things, and you start to question your faith in those things, right? So do we have faith in the senses, or do we have faith in impermanence? And so you start to question that. And that's how you can, see, like, oh, how faithful are you, right? And you might get to a point where you have so much faith in impermanence, so much trust, like that's that you put all your chips there, and you take away your faith in everything else. It's like you're diving deep into that, and it's like everything else could go, and that's the only thing that you trust. Then, if you really get like that, yeah, you will probably, realize stream entry before you pass away. Because when you die, also you have to let go of everything. So you're going to be, before that point, you're really going to be pushed to accept it, because you're already inclining towards accepting it. Like, you're not rejecting it. So the other thing is, like, if you have any kind of doubts, like, I don't know, maybe, this is permanent. Most people, they're not going to think that their eye, ear, nose, tongue, or body is permanent, because it's pretty obvious that they're not, right? It doesn't take a genius. It can be an obstacle if, you think like you're going to, with new science or whatever, you can live forever, or that maybe other people die, but you don't, or, it can of course become a problem. And of course our behavior is one thing apart from our intellectual ideas, but usually the problem is the mind, that's usually where it's at. So it's also questioning, like, how much do you think that the mind is permanent? And that means everything. That's, as the Buddha says, Ajhatang va bihitha va oladikang va sukhamang va hinang va panitang va. So that means internal, external, coarse or fine, low or sublime. So, like, what am I pointing to? Including the sublime, basically. So including the universal consciousness or whatever type of mind experience that you might be thinking is permanent. It's really questioning, like, is it though? Or is that just another image in your mind, another idea that's arising and ceasing? So it's also important to question those types of things and see, like, do we have doubts about that, right? And but apart from that, assuming that you don't have doubts about it, right? Assuming that you're really ready to say not a single thing is going to last. Every single thing that you cherish, every single thing that you think is always going to be there, up to the most refined, subtle, sublime thing. If you really accept, like, that's impermanent, then you just start to place your chips there, right? And in terms of the wisdom, then it's very similar. You investigate. I mentioned some of those contemplations. You start to investigate. So maybe you say, I don't know if I trust that, but you can investigate it. And, usually you're going to fall on one or the other side if you really go for it. That's why the Buddha is saying that people who really go for it, they're going to fall on one or the other side. Either they're going to just end up having lots of confidence, or they're going to have, focus on their discernment. But eventually, someone who's practicing deeply, they're going to fall on one or the other side. And then you say, follow-up question, would acts of loving kindness informed by right view of impermanence be more helpful and beneficial? For example, a friend just said they felt low energy. Next time I hear that, should I say something like, don't worry, friend, feeling low energy is in constant, changeable, and alterable, or similar joys? Well, of course, helping, with loving kindness and loving and metta and so on, and compassion, using right speech, of course, yeah, that's going to be helpful in your practice. I'm not sure how directly helpful it would be for this particular point. Though, of course, it could be, but really what matters is not so much what you say, but it's more how you're thinking. So, many people will say, oh, don't worry, it's impermanent. But sometimes that is actually used as almost like a, don't worry, at the end of the day, these things are reliable type of attitude. Like, oh, don't worry, this bad emotion is impermanent. At the end of the day, you're going to get back to what you like. You're going to get back to the good moods. So actually, that's almost betraying a kind of attitude of attachment, honestly, right? It's kind of like, well, the good moods, I'm waiting for the good ones. I'm expecting them. I'm craving for them. I'm hoping for them. I'm praying for them. And I'm using reminders like impermanence to make me endure so that I can finally get what I want. So it's kind of like you're at the candy store and you're waiting in line and you just remind yourself, like, don't worry, this line's impermanent. Eventually, I'm going to get the candy. So, you're doing that to get the candy, not actually reflecting on impermanence very deeply, right? So yeah, it's, of course, yes, the line is impermanent. Eventually, you're going to get to the end of the line, but that's not really the point, right? The point isn't to use reflections on impermanence to help us endure so that we can get what we want. Rather, it's actually to make us think that we're not going to ever get what we want ultimately. We're never ultimately going to be satisfied. So that doesn't mean that you can't encourage people. When someone's in a low mood, of course, you can remind them it's impermanent and uplift them. That's good. Sometimes people, they need to hear things like that, right? But actually, from the perspective of the Dhamma, low mood, high mood, they're just moods. And the real, the deeper point is like, actually, well, the mind is impermanent itself. So like any mood, they're not personal. They're just temporary, fleeting occurrences. Nothing to get wrapped up about. So there's a monk, Ajahn Liam, quite a famous monk. He's the abbot of Wat Nong Papong, so Ajahn Chah's monastery. And Ajahn Chah entrusted him to the monastery before he died, before he lost his speech, and then he became the abbot. And so he's kind of considered, Ajahn Chah is almost like Dharma heir. And Ajahn Liam, and there's one story of Ajahn Liam that at Ajahn Chah's funeral, they cremate the bodies in Thailand. And I don't know the details, but this is what I've heard, at least, is that at Ajahn Chah's funeral, there was a problem with the funeral pyre, and it basically started like a fire in the monastery, and it set on fire. And Ajahn Liam saw that, and then he went to sleep. He went to bed. So he was like, "Oh, what are you going to do?" And he went to sleep, at his teacher's funeral, like his the abbot of the monastery. It's like, oh, it's on fire. And but anyway, so the point is that Ajahn Liam, he's very, kind of let go type of attitude. And if you read, he has like little short things about his practice where he kind of describes like what was his practice. And it's actually, I really recommend you read it. It's actually very like, it's almost funny because he basically says like that he would, sometimes he would be experiencing like extreme bliss and rapture, and sometimes he would be like suffering, like deep suffering and just like almost all blackness. And he was like, but I just didn't really bother, just not that important. Just kind of kept going and doesn't really give it much consideration. It's just like, he just didn't really care. It's just like, whatever, the mind is suffering, the mind is happy, like whatever. So it's actually the same, like that's actual confidence in impermanence. So yeah, so I don't say that to discourage you, Joe, from encouraging your friends with those types of reflections, but I more just mean that we have to be careful that actually sometimes impermanence can be used the wrong way, right? Like grabbing the snake by the wrong end. So if we use impermanence as a way to become more attached to what we like, then and kind of ride out the difficult times, then actually we might not be inclining our mind in the right direction. Right? The more thing would be like good, bad, type of thing, right? Okay. But of course, loving kindness would be useful for, loving kindness is always the answer, right? So, loving kindness is of course useful. I just more mean the specific way of using loving kindness might be a little bit more would you say provincial? I think, no, provisional. That's the word, provisional. And Sean says that he recently fell into a rabbit hole of teachings and essays on the concept of anatta, with some respected teachers seeming to have different views. I was hoping you would be kind enough to share your interpretation of the Buddha's teaching of anatta and how it could apply to one's practice and progress on the path. Okay, well, yeah, so yeah, the teachings of anatta, the teachings of, for those who don't know, anatta is the Pali word for not self, or non-self, or what would you say? It's actually kind of like a Buddhist hybrid English phrase. It's more like not yourself or something. Right? In English, we actually wouldn't really say your body is not self. Like, what does that even mean? We'd say like your body's not yourself. So yeah, anatta means not yourself. It means impersonal. It means not your identity, not who you really are, not kind of your core, not in your control, and so on. So it has different meanings, different nuances. And you talk about how different people have different opinions. And yeah, of course, right? People have different opinions about just about anything, right? Um, and as the wise folk saying goes, um, everyone has opinions and they stink, right? So you're asking for another one. And one thing to keep in mind is, how do we deal with these different opinions when people say different things about the path and people say different things about the teachings? And at the end of the day, actually, you can't find the answer in what people say. You have to find the answer in your own practice. So, one person says this, one person says that, and then you go and you say, ask someone else, what do you say? And then you ask someone else, what do they say? You'll never find the answer. So the way you find the answer is by practicing. And you ask yourself, what is the right one? Now, of course, you have to be careful with that. Because if you ask yourself, you just might be, wrong, right? You just might be biased. So, of course, we always have to balance the idea of self-inquiry and practice with study. The Buddha he wouldn't have spent 45 years of his life teaching if all you needed to do was go meditate. What's the point? What's the point of becoming a Buddha? Just go watch your breath. So if you can become a Buddha on your own, go ahead, right? So of course we don't want to fall in the pitfall of thinking like, reflect, the Buddha was wasting his time. It's almost like a sign of ingratitude to say that, studying or reflecting on the Buddha's teachings is not helpful. It's kind of like, well, who do you think the Buddha, what was he doing then? So of course we need to be careful about that, but we also do need to be careful about the opposite extreme. The opposite extreme being that we can find the answer through study, through listening, through opinions, and through writings and so on. So that is important also to remember that, you can't. So it's like you go to the restaurant and you go to a restaurant sampling. So I remember, where I was from, and I'm sure in many cities, and I think also in Italy and Acquaviva, they have this where certain times of the year, they'll have like a restaurant, like a week basically, where you go to different restaurants and they're kind of on a roster and, you can try out different foods. It's kind of like restaurant week or whatever, right? And so, imagine you go to these different restaurants and say that they're all making some kind of soup. So you try out, okay, what's this soup? What's the soup at this restaurant like? What's the soup at that restaurant like? Who makes the soup the best? Who makes the best soup in this village, in this town? And so you go to all the different restaurants and you go and you sit down and you say, can I have your menu, please? Can I have the recipe for your soup? So you get the recipe and you start eating it. Then you go to the next restaurant, you say, can I have the recipe for your soup, please? And you start eating it. And you go to the next one and you ask for the recipe and you start eating it. And then at the end of this, you ask yourself, well, which soup is the best? You don't know. You haven't tried the soup. You've only eaten you've eaten the recipe, right? So just writing it down and consuming it, that's not actually the taste of the soup. Can you make the soup without the recipe? No, you can't. If you go and you say, I want to make the soup, and you don't ask for the recipe, you're not going to be able to make it. It's different. Like if I just tell you, oh, just make a soup, you don't need to study, just go make a soup in your own kitchen. Well, there's a difference between a professional chef making a soup and someone who's never cooked that soup in their life. So you can't just go make it in your kitchen, right? But the recipe matters. But you can't also expect the recipe to be the soup. So you have to balance those. You have to see like what people say, thinking that that's the answer. That's like eating the recipe. Not looking for the opinions of others. That's like trying to go make the soup without any instructions. So what do? You use the recipe to make the soup. You use the instructions that you have and you try to follow those. You try to experiment and you try to see to the best of your ability. And in the meantime, you build up the conditions to help you see more clearly, right? So if you just ask yourself which one's true, you might just be thinking about it or whatever. But do you build up the sila? Do you build up the purity? Do you watch your intentions? When you watch your intentions through developing sila, you start to see more subtle layers of your mind, more subtle layers of your body, more subtle layers of your life, of your existence, of your attitudes. So you start to understand deeper. And then you start developing your meditation. Can you make your mind calm? Can you make your mind clear? Can you understand more subtle, more coarse things? Can you lessen your attachments? And then can you look into those things? So yeah, it's trying to find a balance and trying to find that some kind of practice that you can apply those different reflections and experiment with them. But one thing I will say on this is that it is important that there are suttas where the Buddha compares different views, and he says, he'll look at different people saying different things, and he'll say, some people say this and some people say that, and he'll compare and he'll say which one is closer to attachment, which one is closer to grasping, and then he'll praise the one which is less close to attachment, which is more close to letting go, which lets go of more. So if you get a teaching which says, you only need to let go of this much, but not that much, and then you get another teaching which says, actually, you need to let go of even that much. Well, the Buddha would say, which one's closer to attachment? Which one's closer to grasping? And usually, I don't know of any case where the Buddha didn't praise the one which was more close to letting go. Right? So, for example, the Buddha actually praised the annihilationists of his time because he said they were closer to letting go of their attachments. Although they had a wrong view, it wasn't right. But the eternalists was closer to grasping. It was closer to attachment because they weren't ready to accept that things could cease. So it was closer to attachment. So although eternalism and annihilationism are both equally wrong, they're both wrong view, the Buddha actually praised the annihilationists because he said that they are closer to letting go. So it's similar, you can just apply these types of things and just see which one seems to be kind of implying that you can hold on to more, that you can kind of, don't have to let go so much. Then probably that one you should be questioning it, right? You should be a little bit more skeptical of it. If it is true, then you want to really put it to the test, because you should really be very, very skeptical of something which is less close to attachment. Or I'm sorry, which is closer to attachment. Something which is inclining more towards the keeping side, the holding side. You want to be very, very careful around those types of things, because we like to hold things. And Richard says that his mom has a cousin who is your enemy. Wait, no. His enemy, so who is him? Oh, okay, so your mom, okay. So your mom has a cousin and she is his enemy. And he even put her in jail once by a lie. How do you not get depressed knowing that even bad people can have good rebirths due to their past lives' good karma? You say, I'd like karma to catch him in his next life, but according to the Buddha, it might not happen immediately. He could even have a good rebirth in heaven due to his past lives' good karma. Thank you. Well, Richard, it sounds like I wouldn't recommend, hoping that he gets karma going to get him, karma going to catch him for all the bad he's done to you. That's vengeance. You're hoping that he suffers. Actually, that's called intentions of cruelty, right? So you're hoping, you're planning, you're wishing, you're inclining your mind to hope that he suffers. So that's actually wrong intention. That's in the Noble Eightfold Path, the Buddha talks about samma sankappa, right thought or right intention. And, the second one or the third one in there is non-harming. So, not wanting beings to suffer. So if you're thinking how can I not get sad thinking that he might go to heaven? It's well, actually, you should be happy about that. I hope that he, goes to heaven. I hope that he doesn't suffer because of all the horrible things he's done, right? So what I would recommend is using, it might be difficult, but the ideal thing would be to practice what we call mudita. Mudita is when you rejoice. It's the opposite of wanting beings to suffer. And well, it's not exactly the opposite. That's more compassion. So that's also good. But mudita is when you're happy for other people. So specifically, you're talking about being being depressed about him going to heaven. So that's why I mentioned mudita. So mudita, you can rejoice and think like whatever happiness he has, whatever happiness he receives, whether in this life or in the future lives, whatever happiness he has, any goodness, any beauty, any blessings he encounters, may he never lose those. May he always be happy. I'm so happy for him. I'm so happy that he gets to have that. May he always have that. May he always remain happy like that. Like, oh yes, that's amazing. I'm so happy for you. That's so wonderful that you got, that you were happy, that you're successful, that you're blessed, that you're in heaven. That type of attitude. So you're noticing right here, you're noticing mudita and its opposite. So imagine if this was your mom. Would you be depressed that your mom went to heaven if she did good things? I don't know your mom, but let's say that you're happy and you think that she's a good person. Would you be thinking, oh, I'm so happy that she's going to heaven. Yay, yay, I'm so happy for her. Right? You wouldn't be depressed about it. So why is it different for this person? So mudita is rejoicing in other people's happiness. And actually having a recent conversation here at the monastery with someone who was asking about this, he really helped me clarify about, we are rejoicing in the happiness of the beings, not in the specific what causes the happiness. So like when someone's happy, we're happy that they're happy. Like I'm happy for you that you're happy. We don't want to be happy necessarily for why they're happy. Right? So the example that he was mentioning was, being at a bar and like people talking about bourbon and talking about alcohol and really enjoying the conversation and being like, oh, I'm so happy that you're having an interesting conversation. I'm happy that you're enjoying yourself, but I'm not happy. It's not like, oh, may you never be parted from bourbon. May you always have alcohol. May you always have, friends in bars. It's not that, but it's rather rejoicing in people being happy. And I bet that you've experienced that. Actually, everyone has experienced all the Brahma Viharas, just not necessarily in an unconditional way. Everyone has experienced some kind of care, love, friendliness. Everyone has experienced some kind of compassion. Everyone has experienced some kind of rejoicing, and everyone has experienced some kind of equanimity. It might not have been a lot. It might not have been unconditional. It might not have been perfect or blissful or, lasting a long time. But I bet you that you've experienced all four of them. These are common emotions. They're normal emotions. They're wholesome emotions. That simply, can we extend them? Can we cultivate them intentionally? Right? That's what Buddhism is saying. The Buddha is not inventing loving kindness. He's not inventing rejoicing. He's not inventing compassion or equanimity. He's just saying you can cultivate these. You don't need to be pushed and pulled and swayed and kind of made a victim of your emotions, of your mind. You can train your mind. You can develop loving kindness. It's not like you have it towards some people, not others, and that's just how it is, period, end of story. You actually can cultivate it. There are conditions for it. So it's the same with rejoicing. Find someone who you rejoice in. Find someone who you would be happy that they go to heaven. And see, how does that feel? What does it feel like to rejoice in someone else's happiness? Can you feel the same way for this person? Thinking, whatever they did, you're not rejoicing in what they've done, but can you recognize that they're just another sentient being, just another being in samsara? And they just want to be happy. So it's wonderful when they get that. And compassion is understanding that they want to be happy, but they actually cause suffering. They're actually suffering. So may they be free of that. So loving kindness is just the plain wish, may they be happy. It starts there. Loving kindness comes from a recognition, I want to be happy. Everyone else is just like me. They want to be happy too. So may we all be happy. Compassion it's based off that understanding. The understanding of may we be happy, but many people are not happy and they're suffering. Actually, everyone has some kind of suffering. Like even an arahant might get sick, so you might still wish, oh, may they be free of the sickness, right? Not necessarily that their mind is suffering or anything like that, but may they be free of the sickness. You might wish that for someone. Even someone who's enlightened, you might think, oh, may you get over the sickness, may your body be at ease, so on. So actually everyone experiences some kind of difficulty in life, because as long as you're in samsara, what is the nature of samsara? It's difficult. It has difficulties. It's impossible not for it not to be so, right? So you have compassion, like may we be free of, may all the suffering abate, may it all become easeful. Because of the basis in wanting people to be happy, and the basis understanding that we all want to be happy. And it's the same with mudita. Well, if we all want to be happy, then when someone is happy, we should be rejoicing in that. Like, that's wonderful. That's amazing, right? It's natural. If you want people to be relieved from suffering, when they are relieved from suffering to some extent, you would be so happy for them. That's mudita. So just recognizing, like, this person, they have caused themselves a lot of suffering. Any bad deeds they've done, they have sowed seeds for suffering. You said that they lied, that they put people in jail, they have caused future suffering for themselves. The Buddha says it's not possible that an act based in greed, hatred, and delusion will lead to happiness from that alone, will lead to a good rebirth by that alone. It's not possible that an act based in non-greed, based in non-hatred, and based in non-delusion, based on that alone, will lead to a bad destination. What does that mean? Basically, any deed which is unwholesome, in and of itself, it will lead to unwholesome results. Of course, you mentioned that there are other factors, and it could be delayed, and they actually could have a good rebirth because of other deeds that they've done. But at the end of the day, that deed that they've done will lead to suffering. It's a cause of suffering. So you should have compassion. Because not only did they cause your mother suffering, not only did they cause your family suffering, they have caused themselves suffering. Like, what a horrible scenario. Imagine, like, when someone does bad and they cause other people to suffer, you think it's bad enough. Like, they've already, it's bad enough as is causing suffering to people. It's even worse when you think about how horrible of a cycle it is. They cause suffering to others, and then because of that, they cause suffering to themselves. So then they might get reborn in a bad place, where then they have less ability to not cause suffering to others. It's a horrible cycle of suffering. May they be free of that. Any relief that they get from that, any happiness that they get, wow, that's amazing. May you be so happy for them, because it's already bad enough as it is. So you try to develop those two Brahmaviharas, right? Compassion and rejoicing based off of loving kindness, which is the foundation. And of course, you can also apply it to your mother. You can apply it to yourself, right? It's not just towards the so-called perpetrators, right? Remembering that the perpetrators are the victims and the victims are the perpetrators. It goes both ways, right? But so understanding that actually it's universal. You don't have to just be favoring that person. But that's how you get rid of depression. How do you get over being upset when other people are happy? You develop mudita. And sometimes it has to come in the baseline of compassion, which has to come in the base of loving kindness. So those are a few thoughts. But of course it's difficult, Richard, and I'm really sorry that that's happened to your family. But just understand that actually it's normal. When I was in Italy, there was a cat, and let's just say that the family was not a happy family. Like the mom and the son and the father, it was just a nightmare. Like the mom had kids with the son, and then the dad would come and try to beat up the son and like assault him. And so, there's many horrors of samsara. It can get much, much worse than the human realm, and it can get much, much better. So any happiness, any relief that exists, we should be rejoicing in that. Like, oh man, I'm so happy that those people get some relief, and may we all be free of suffering. Okay, and Victoria has a practical question. Says, what's the best way to contact the monastery at the moment? Is the email still down? I've sent a few messages about my stay next month and want to make sure they're going to the right place. Hello, Victoria. Yeah, the email is okay. We're just a little bit behind right now on the emails, so we'll get to you. Sorry about the delay. Bandisudaso is currently in Italy. So also some things that require, the attention of different monastics, sometimes it's a little bit more delayed and so on. And so, yeah, the email is okay. And sometimes we're just a little bit slow. And then Gregory asks another practical question. Has the date for this year's Katina ceremony at Empty Cloud been announced? I don't believe it has. Yeah, I don't believe so. But it would be in October. Well, I don't know actually. No, so I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I can't say about that. And Jody says, asking, in regards to Theravada, is it recommended to have an altar in your home, and why? Well, usually in Theravada countries, it's very common to have an altar in your home. So why? Well, because devotion, faith, they are so powerful. If you don't have faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, you're not going to practice. So when you cultivate things like faith, reverence, offerings, humility, respect, admiration, appreciation, gratitude, it makes you want to practice. And it inclines your mind towards the Dhamma. It inclines your mind towards those things. So everyone has an altar in their home. So here in the foyer, there's a cabinet where they used to store wine bottles. And I believe that in there they have their lazy boy chairs, and they would smoke their cigars, probably drink some alcohol, maybe watch sports. So that was at least one of the altars in the building. So everyone has an altar, and everyone has faith in something. And if you look at the state of the world right now, there is a profound faith, like a deep faith in, basically things like techno-capitalism or something, whatever you might call it. And it's interesting, right? Because if you look at, we talk about not having blind faith and blah, blah, blah. But if you look at where has the faith in techno-capitalism, where has it led us? Look at the state of the world. So religion might be bad. In about a few hundred years, religion never got us to this state of the world that techno-capitalism has got us. Religion's been around for quite a long time, and the world has been going it's been going okay. In a few hundred years, the world has just about been destroyed through blind faith and techno-capitalism, thinking through this we'll be happy, through this we'll advance. Look around you. Have we advanced? No, we have not. Things have gotten the opposite of advanced. Nature has been destroyed. The human mind has been destroyed. Happiness has been destroyed. Nations have been destroyed. Families have been destroyed. Everything has been destroyed. And yet, we still believe, well, things are advancing. Things are getting better. Things are more advanced than before. Things are not so backwards. Where has the blind faith in the face of all the evidence come from? Well, one of the things is the altar in the home, right? The smartphone, the Apple Watch, the Apple TV, if that exists still. So the altar, when you're worshiping 24/7, your gods, Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, probably label, like it's like a Greek pantheon. You could probably label about all 10 on your hand, right? It's like a pantheon of them. And so, yeah, when you're worshiping those, what do? Well, then you act in accordance with that. Temple says buy this, you do it. Amazon says you have to pay your tithe, you do it. Google says you're going to use this now, you do it. So yeah, we need to offset that. And so we take refuge in the Buddha and the Dhamma and in the Sangha. We make offerings to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. We recollect the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. We bow to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. We remember them, we reflect on them, we're mindful of them, and that nourishes our practice. It nourishes our mind. It gives us refuge, stability. It gives us direction. And the Buddha advised his householders, you should recollect the Buddha when you're going about your day, when you're walking, standing, sitting, lying down, and when you're with your home, when your family's with your children. He specifically says, even when you're in the busyness of the home life with your children and families, you should recollect the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, because your mind will find inspiration. It will find joy. It will find rapture and bliss. And so he recommended recollecting those things. So what better way to recollect them than to have an altar in your place to remind you of that, to offer to that, to bow to that. So that's a wonderful thing to follow the Buddha's instructions. And so there's many, many benefits, but those are, a few things that come to mind. And it is recommended by most people. Okay, and then Ashish Mehta says, Dear Bhante, question on dependent origination. From Sutta Central Digha Nikaya 15, the Pali text reads, Ittiko ananda namarupa pacya vijnana, vijnana pacya namarupa. This translates to name and form are conditions for consciousness. Consciousness is a condition for name and form. Is this circular? Can you help clarify? Yes, so great, Ashish. Glad you're reading the suttas and glad you're reading Digha Nikaya 15, the Mahanidana Sutta, the greater discourse on dependent origination. And in fact, in that sutta, the Buddha talks about how Namarupa, or name and form, are dependent on consciousness, vijnana, and how consciousness, vijnana, is dependent on name and form, Namarupa. And actually, the Buddha explains in that sutta, he explains what it means. He says, Namarupa pacya vijnana. So he says, Itikopane ananda vuttang. And he talks, so that's what I said, Ananda, and why did I say it? And he says that if consciousness were not to enter into the womb, would name and form take shape there? And Ananda says, no, Bhante. And he says, if Ananda, consciousness were to depart from the womb, would name and form come to development and growth? And Ananda says, no, Bhante. And then Ananda said, the Buddha says, if the consciousness of that young boy or girl were to be cut off early, would their body basically mature and develop all the way? And he says, no, Bhante. He says, in this way, you should understand that Namarupa, name and form, depend on consciousness. And he says, consciousness is dependent on name and form. So Namarupa pacya vijnana. Vijnana pacya Namarupang is the first one, I'm sorry. And Namarupa pacya vijnana is the second one. And he says, how should you understand that? He said, well, if consciousness didn't gain a footing, if it didn't get established and settled into name and form, would there come to be the future birth, old age, sickness, and death? The coming to be of suffering in the future? And the Ananda says no. So what is he pointing to? What is he talking about there? Well, basically, if we didn't have consciousness, our mind and our body, they would die. So what is the difference between an alive body and a dead one? It's consciousness, right? So if consciousness leaves their body, they're dead. And if a child is developing in the womb and consciousness leaves, if it dies, then it doesn't grow up into a child, right? That's obvious. We can see that. So what is the difference between a child which develops and grows into an adult, and a living adult, and a child which dies and doesn't mature, or an adult who's dead? The difference is consciousness. So that's what the Buddha is. It's very simple. It is very profound, but it also just starts with that very simple thing of like, if you weren't conscious, you would be dead. Your mind and body would not work. So mind and body require consciousness. But actually, consciousness doesn't exist in and of itself. It's not like a soul which is kind of traveling around and animating the mind and the body. Because actually, if consciousness didn't get a footing in a mind and body, if there wasn't a mind and a body to be conscious, then there would be no consciousness. So what is consciousness? It is the consciousness of the mind and body. Like, it doesn't exist independently of those things. And what is the mind and body? Well, it is something which has consciousness. It's an organism with consciousness. That's what it is. So they're dependent. Like, you can't have consciousness in and of itself. It doesn't make any sense. Like, what is conscious? Conscious of what? So it's kind of like if I say, your tongue is tasting, you're aware of tasting, but there's no tastes. Well, then you're not aware of tasting. If there's no tastes, you're not tasting anything. So unless it's the neutral taste, like the taste of neutrality, in which case you are tasting something, you're tasting neutral sensation, right? So actually, if there really is no taste, if there's nothing to be aware of, then you're not tasting anything. There is no consciousness there. Or it's like, imagine your eyes, but you're not seeing anything. Then you're not seeing. That's called blindness. That's not seeing. So consciousness, if your eye consciousness is not aware of anything, you would be blind. That's what we call blindness. Blindness means eye consciousness not working, nothing to be aware of. So what does it mean if there was no consciousness whatsoever? There would be no mind and body. There would be no living organism. There would be no suffering. There would be no samsara. There would be no being, because consciousness refers to the working awareness of sensory things. It refers to the awareness of mind and body, the awareness of some kind of experience of something. It's the presence of some kind of experience. So if there wasn't a mind and body, there wouldn't be any consciousness. But like I said, if there was no consciousness, there would be no mind and body. If you're unconscious, you wouldn't have sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. You wouldn't have eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. You wouldn't have a working heart. You wouldn't have a working brain. You wouldn't have any being, whether an animal, ghost, hell being, human being, deva, brahma. There would be no beings, because in order to have those beings, they need to be conscious. There needs to be consciousness. So that's what the Buddha is actually pointing to, is that in order to have a living being, there needs to be consciousness. But in order to have consciousness, there needs to be the mind and body. There needs to be the being there. So is it circular? Well, at one point, Venerable Sariputta, he says that he talks about this in another sutta. I believe it's Samyutta Nikaya 12.67, called the Nalakalapi Sutta, means the sheaves of reeds. And in that sutta, Venerable Sariputta says that it's like two sheaves of reeds. One is leaning against the other. So if one falls down, the other falls. And if the other falls down, then the opposite one will fall down, right? So if two things are leaning against each other, then they, either they're both standing or they both fall. There's no such thing as just one standing alone. So that's the point here, is that consciousness, it doesn't exist in and of itself. It doesn't have independent existence. If it did, that would be yourself, would be your soul, just be something which is independently there, free of other conditions. That would be yourself. So the Buddha could have just easily enough said that. Vijnanagata. So consciousness is yourself. So it only takes two Pali words to say it. But he said Vijnanang anatta. Consciousness is not yourself. Why? Well, one reason is because it's dependently originated. It doesn't exist independently. It means that only certain conditions is consciousness present. And at the same time, Namarupa, which refers to the other four, one way of putting it, it's not exactly the same, but another scheme is the five aggregates, right? And in the five aggregates, you have consciousness, and then you have the other four aggregates, which are form, feeling, perception, and intentions. And there's some suttas where actually the Buddha gives a very similar teaching, but he's not talking about dependent origination. He's talking about the five aggregates. And he says, monks, someone might say, apart from form, apart from feeling, apart from perception, apart from intentions, they'll describe the coming and going of consciousness and so on. He says that's not possible. It's not possible for consciousness to exist independently of the other four aggregates. And he talks about how consciousness is dependent on the other four aggregates. So the other four aggregates are another way of putting Namarupa, another way of putting name and form, the mind and body, basically everything that consciousness is aware of, everything that consciousness is dependent on and based in. And so, yeah, consciousness depends on those things, but those things depend on consciousness. You can't be feeling anything if you're not conscious. Your body wouldn't be a living body if you didn't have consciousness. You wouldn't be perceiving anything if you weren't conscious. You couldn't make any choices if you weren't conscious. So all the other aggregates, all your components of body and mind, they depend on consciousness, right? So it kind of goes around and around like that, like two sheaves of reeds. And the idea is that that's really the linchpin of samsara, right? The Buddha says, etavata, like to that extent, there is the cycle of rebirth and death. To that extent, there is samsara. To that extent, there is the pointing out of suffering, basically. So it's to that extent. Namarupa patya vijnana, vijnana patya namarupa. These two being dependent on one another. That's when you boil it down, what is samsara? It's that. That's what it is. It's simply consciousness depending on name and form depending on consciousness. That's it. That's what samsara is. So when the Buddha is describing his awakening experience, actually he talks about how basically his insight was into that. There's one sutta where he talks about that. That basically probably what it was when he attained stream entry, he had insight into that. into that particular those two things being dependent. Because really all of Buddhism boils down to that. Non-self, dependent origination, impermanence. It boils down to that, because that's the Four Noble Truths right there. The Four Noble Truths are these things depend on one another because of craving. So these things depending on one another, this is samsara right here. What's the origin of it? The origin is craving. What's the cessation of it? It's when craving ceases. Then those things will cease. You won't be reborn again. So it's kind of circular, but it's not circular in time. It is more circular in structure, right? Circular in dependency. So it's more like the sheaf of reeds image, right? It's more like when one is there, the other is there. So it's not like they're kind of circling around each other in time, though that's also true. You could think about it like that. But they are dependent on one another mutually. And in later Buddhism, these are called anyamanya paccayata, means conditioning each other. They condition one another. So it's kind of a really long topic, but that is the basic kind of rough summary of it. And if you'd like to learn more, then one thing you can do is you can look at some of the suttas that I mentioned. So looking at Samyutta Nikaya 12.65, and I'll put these in the chat, and also 12.67, and also Majjhima Nikaya 38 is a good one, where the Buddha talks about how consciousness roaming around in and of itself, kind of independently, is a wrong view, and so on. And he talks about dependent origination. So those are some suttas to look into that topic. Okay, and then Ryan says, Dear Bhante, how about that karma of the one survivor from 240-ish Air India flight? Are you asking like, did they, I don't know if this was a recent crash or something like that, but I assume it is. So what about the karma of that person? I don't know what you're insinuating. I mean, I think I get the gist of what you might be insinuating, Ryan, but I don't know what you want me to say about it, I guess. And then Manny says, Bhante, please elaborate about the emptiness discussed in your previous talks. So let's see, we've given 4 talks now, 4 talks on emptiness, and there's another one coming up. So I don't know what else to say. I mean, I could keep talking about it, but of course there's always more things to say, but I don't know exactly how to elaborate without, we have a Dhamma talk coming up. So I would recommend maybe go to, in a week's time, Wednesday evening, I think it's Wednesday evening, there'll be a Dhamma talk on that. So I don't know what in this moment, what I could really say about it, other than maybe watch the talks. And also watch other people's talks, listen to other people's talks and read the sutta for yourself. Because when you read it for yourself, different things will stick out. And when other people talk about it, they'll emphasize different things. So those are some other points, look at other things, and that can be helpful as well. Because one thing to keep in mind is whenever we give a Dhamma talk, well, at least when I give a Dhamma talk, when I'm sharing, Dhamma ideas and so on, ideas about the Dhamma, then it's kind of like, what is it? What is it's like, you have a million possibilities and you have to pick one. So you're kind of zooming in on one particular thing, but you could talk about basically anything. You know what I mean? So any kind of talk, it's really specific to that thing. Whatever came out at that time, that was the talk. But actually, it could have been a totally different type of thing, relatively speaking. So, different times you'll get different things emphasized. So in a year, if, for whatever reason, if I'm, alive and the conditions come together that for some reason I'm talking about emptiness, I might say something totally different, because that's what comes out at the time. So, it's good to hear different perspectives and to reflect on it. And to remember, at the end of the day, as I was mentioning before, if you want to know about emptiness, go sit down, go sit in a quiet room, and you start to learn. Because at the end of the day, that's what the Buddha is talking about. And then Gregory is asking, can you share examples from the suttas of the effects of karma in this very life instead of in future lives? Well, okay, so the Buddha talks about how karma can ripen either in this life, either in a second life, like the life after, or in some future lifetime. Right, so that's in terms of time. So it can either, ripen in this life, the next one, or in a future lifetime after the next one. Does he give any examples of how it ripens in this very lifetime? I'm not 100% sure of places where he talks about that explicitly. He does talk about the benefits of things like sila in this lifetime. So, for example, he talks about how when you follow sila, people will tend to trust and respect you. They'll feel safe around you. So that's an immediate effect, right? And also you'll feel happy. So that's an immediate effect of karma. Like when you do something, what is the basic principle of karma? Well, the basic idea is that the Buddha is talking about how our ethical choices, there's a cause and effect relationship, a conditional relationship between choices and feelings. So certain choices, they have effects on feelings. So why is that important to mention? Well, because you might say, well, so-and-so acted unskillfully and they actually got pleasure. And then so-and-so acted skillfully and they actually got pain. So like earlier, someone was mentioning, someone lied. So maybe by lying, you get yourself out of trouble and you're more comfortable. And then someone else who told the truth, they actually suffer. So what is the point on karma? The Buddhist teaching on karma is that actually unskillful, unwholesome action, it leads to painful feelings, and skillful, wholesome action leads to pleasant feelings. Although we observe in the short term sometimes the opposite. So when you experience happiness and pleasure, when you experience lightness and ease, when you experience good, comfortable, favorable conditions, like people trusting you, people feeling safe around you, you feeling safe with yourself, feeling good with yourself, your meditation being better, you're experiencing the connection between skillful action and pleasant feeling, right? You're experiencing the conditional relationship there. Like, when action is skillful, when the mind is inclining towards skillfulness, then it becomes more pleasurable. When the mind inclines towards unskillfulness, you start to notice the unwholesome, painful aspects. So what happens when people don't focus on karma, when they're focusing instead on the vipaka being the results, vipaka being the kind of winds of the world, the sort of conditions of external things that happen? Well, then you might start thinking, you can find more pleasure when you do unskillful things. But actually, if you look closer, you'll notice that actually that's not necessarily the case. That actually the mind experiences painful things, and that you use unskillfulness to try to ferret out and avoid the pain temporarily. But actually, you're kind of you're digging yourself into a hole more and more. So like imagine you're digging a hole and you get to a point where like all of a sudden there's many disturbing insects around. So you think, oh, I don't like these insects. So you want to get away from them. So you start digging deeper, like, get away, get away, get away. So it seems like the digging is actually getting you away from like the scary things, but actually you're going deeper into the hole. You're actually making it worse. So if you stop and you look at your actions, look at your inclination of your mind, just the state of your body, the state of your relationships, the state of your heart, and the state of being with yourself, you're going to notice that actually it's getting worse and worse. It's not actually good. And the idea is that, that will manifest externally when it catches up to you. As long as you're running away from it, to a certain extent, you might be able to hide, but eventually you won't be able to. But namely when you die. So that's why sometimes it can wait till the next life or future lives. But the other thing to remember is in Buddhism, we sometimes say, if you want to know what you did in the past, look at what you're experiencing right now. If you want to know what's going to happen in the future, look at what you're doing right now. So if you want to know what are some effects of karma in this very life, we'll just look around. Are you a human? And what's happening in your human life? Some of it could be from this life. Recently, I was on alms round, and I was at the farmer's market, and there was this bread shop. And the line was so long for this bread shop that, like at the farmer's market, that they had one of those chains which has to wrap around and forming a line around it. And there was so many people, like it was constantly selling bread. Like it was just filled with people and the line was very long, constantly full. And that shop, that day, the owner, he gave me 4 massive loaves of bread. And every time we go there, basically every single time, they give us a bunch of bread, like at least a big loaf, very high quality bread, farmer's market, super high quality. And they donate tons of, and this time when he gave me the bread, I wasn't even standing alms. I was actually leaving. I was walking away and he just saw me. He was like, oh, did we give you alms today yet? And I was like, oh no. And he said, usually his wife gives alms, right? So he brought me over, like I wasn't even there. He actually called me over and gave me a bunch of bread. And I even told him, like, I notice a correlation between you have a very generous heart. Like every time they see the monks, they give a bunch of bread, and the shop is super successful. So like, and then you see other people, and maybe their shop isn't so successful, and they're not the generous ones. Of course, you can't necessarily correlate it like that. It doesn't always work like that. But it seems like, maybe they're experiencing some immediate results. Like they're being very generous. And actually, if you look at the history of Buddhist Insights, this organization, whenever they were having a hard time, so like Buddhist Insights, when they were in the Rockaway place, I was told by like Ayasoma that sometimes they didn't think they were going to be able to pay the bills. Like it was really, really tight. And whenever they would have a hard time, like whenever they were thinking like they're going to go under, they would start giving more. So like they started having a hard time. So then they started hosting free dinners in the neighborhood where they would invite all their neighbors to have free food, and they started offering free food. And they always offered retreats free. So whenever they started having a hard time, they started offering more, and they never went under. They always had money. They always made it through. Like, so that could be, the results of karma in this very life. They, like, whenever you're having a hard time, you're going to think, oh, we need to market more. Maybe we should start charging. But actually they started selling. They started giving more. They started giving away. And they made it. They were successful, very successful. And they actually acquired this property they raised, I think, was it $100,000?
Something like that.
Yeah, so they raised like $100,000 in 3 months. And everyone was saying, basically it was impossible. And they did it. And they acquired this building when the odds were against them. The realtor told them they couldn't see it. So what happened? Well, through generosity, maybe, right? Through giving, through a pure heart. So things start working out. And actually, sometimes you might even notice that. Like, sometimes I have noticed, like, it just seems weird sometimes. Like, you just start getting things that you want. And it's weird. It's almost uncanny, like not just in a normal way, but in almost like a strange way. It's kind of like something seems to be going on here. And yeah, so things like health also, when people are sick, there's another story actually I remember hearing. Now some stories are coming to mind. There was a layman and he got cancer in Thailand. He got cancer. And this was recently, like a recent thing as far as I know. And he got, I think, terminal cancer. And he was advised by one of the monks that you should start offering alms food to the monks every single day. So he didn't offer pindapata. So in Thailand, the monks come, and he was advised, like, whenever the monks come, you should start offering food, start cultivating generosity towards the Sangha. And he took on that practice. And when he went to the doctor later on, his cancer was gone. And they had no idea how it happened. Like, he was cured. It was cured. And they didn't know how to explain it. So, that's the case of probably that karma right there. And there's other stories like that, I think. So I think even things like health. Another thing might be, fame. You might see like someone who's, maybe they get a good reputation. They start building, like a lot of people start liking them. A lot of people start building around them. They start building a good reputation, good, a sense of, good following because of their virtue. So yeah, there's many different things where it's hard to say, but there are certain things when you start practicing, you might start to be suspicious that some things are like some karma. You start to maybe get some suspicions about karma and the results of karma. And sometimes it's hard to pin down, but it's just weird things, like why was the man cured? You can't say for sure, but it's just weird. It's very strange, and there's many things like that can happen. Okay, and someone's asking, can you please help me understand ideas of sacredness and holiness in the context of Buddhism? And asking about, okay, so is the Dhamma the truth of existence, or is it with reverence and as holy, something holy? Yeah, so sacredness and holiness, to a certain extent, of course, these are, maybe we call them like Christian or Abrahamic or kind of theistic ideas, right? That things being sacred and holy, kind of almost like it's, like a god or something, right? But yeah, there is definitely an idea. There are elements of sacredness and holiness also to Buddhism. So how exactly does that work? You say, is the Dharma to be understood as a truth of existence or as with reverence as holy? And the answer is both. It's to be understood as the truth of existence, but also reverence as holy. So when the Buddha attained awakening, after he attained awakening, he said that it's suffering to live without respect in the heart. It's suffering to live without reverence and deference. Like it's suffering to be basically kind of, not respecting something. And he said that usually, you respect people who are ahead of you or who are teaching you or, something like that, right? So like the Buddha, there was no senior Buddhist monks to him, right? There was no person above him in Sila. There was no teacher who could teach him Sila. There was no teacher who could teach him Samadhi. There was no teacher who could teach him Panya, wisdom. There was no teacher who could teach him Vimutti, liberation. And there was no teacher who could teach him Vimutti Jnanadasana, knowledge and vision of liberation. So there was no one who he could bow to like that. So he said that he would bow to the Dhamma. And he bowed to the Dhamma itself. He took the Dhamma as his object of bowing. So even the Buddha bowed. Even the Buddha bowed to the Dhamma, thinking like, he was actively looking for something to bow to. It wasn't like, oh, I have to do some bowing today or whatever. He was looking for it actively. And he bowed to the Dhamma because that was what he saw as higher than him. So you don't just bow to I don't think scientists generally bow to gravity or something like that, right? Because it's not really considered holy or sacred. The point is that gravity doesn't liberate you. The Dhamma does. So the Dhamma is the truth of existence, but it's a particular truth of existence. It's the truth which leads you to the end of suffering. So the Four Noble Truths aren't some textbook fact. They are realities which you are to experience for yourself, right? That's why they're called noble truths. Have you ever wondered why they're called that? It doesn't mean that suffering is noble. It isn't, right? Noble ones, the Buddha didn't suffer. He didn't have mental suffering. He relinquished suffering. So, it's not that suffering is noble, right? It's not noble to suffer. They're called Ariya Satya because they are realized by the noble ones. So the Buddha actually says, there's a sutta where he says, why are they called Ariya Satya? And he says, because they are realized by the noble one, realized and taught by the noble one. So when do you become noble? When you see the reality of suffering. When you see the origin of suffering. When you see the end of suffering. When you see the path. That's when you become a noble one. Right? Until that point, then the Four Noble Truths aren't realities. I mean, they don't seem that way, at least, right? It doesn't seem that they're realities. They don't seem true. They seem otherwise. And the Buddha says, what the world says is happiness, the noble ones say is suffering. And what the world says is suffering, the noble ones know is happiness. And the word there is dukkha, sukha and dukkha. And he also says what the world believes is true the noble ones say is false. And what the world says is false, the noble ones say is true. So what is the idea of the noble truths, right, of dukkha and happiness and so on? The idea is that these are things which only the noble ones understand. Only the noble ones see them, only the noble ones know them. So you become a noble one when you see and know them. So they're not some impersonal thing. They're not some textbook thing like that. You can't, they're just, you read about them or whatever. Like, oh, I've heard about those. Well, whether you've heard about them or not, do you see them? Do you know them? So they're noble truths because you have to know them, right? They are noble truths, not readable truths or something like that. And so that's why they're holy. That's why they're sacred. Because like when someone, imagine you're sinking in a river and someone saves your life. Imagine your house is being crushed by a tornado and someone gets you out of there, drives you away. Right? Imagine you're a refugee and you are saved by someone. They bring you to safety. You would have a sense of gratitude towards them. You would have a sense of respect. You might even bow to them. You might be, oh my, thank you so much. So when the Dhamma saves you, it's not some textbook, truth or whatever. It's, it saved your life. It saved you from suffering. So, and if it hasn't, even if it hasn't saved you, you still respect it as that which will save you, that which can save you, that the only thing which can save you. The Buddha says, many people go to many different refuges, to mountains and parks and shrines, right? People go to all different types of things to find refuge. Netang kho saranang kemang, netang saranamuttamang, netang saranamagama sabbadukha vimuchyate. But that is not that's not the safe refuge. That's not the refuge of safety. That's not the supreme refuge. That's not the refuge which, when you go to it, it leads you to the end of suffering. So the Dhamma, when you go to refuge to the Dhamma, it will eventually, if you practice in line with it, lead you to the end of suffering. So it's a special kind of thing. That's why it's holy. That's why it's sacred, right? And same with the Buddha. The Buddha, of course, he's not some kind of immortal, eternal deity or whatever, but he is the reason that you have access to the teachings. He is the person who saved you. Even if you're not saved yet, he's the person who has reached out the hand for you to grab, right? He's the one who risked, he spent his time to teach people. He's the one who went through all that work to realize these things and then teach them to people. And finally, the Sangha, right? The same with the Sangha, the people who are the disciples who have realized that, or the Sangha, people who have just become monastics, even just worldly monastics, right? Who just want to practice or have dedicated their life to the Buddha and the Dhamma. Those people are, as we say, the nurses, right? So it's holy in that sense, right? Holy in the sense of like awe-inspiring, right? So yeah, those are some thoughts. And Daniel says, okay, so the question here, in the 16 steps of mindfulness of breathing, what is the difference between 5, 6, and 10? So these being, you say, piti, sukha, and gladdening the mind. So 5, the Buddha says, for those who don't know, he gives instructions on mindfulness of breathing, and that includes what the Buddha breaks down into 16 steps, which one should train in, or at least 14 steps one should train in. And he, some of those steps, so the 5th one, he says that someone should train thinking piti asasi samiti sikkati and piti pasasi samiti sikkati, as well as sukha, it's actually piti pati sangvedi asasi samiti sikkati, piti pati sangvedi pasasi samiti sikkati. So they train thinking that they will breathe in experiencing rapture. They train such that they will breathe out experiencing rapture. And sukha pati sangvedi asasi samiti sikkati, Sukhapari sangvedi passasi samiti sikkati. They train such that breathing in, they will experience bliss. They train such that breathing out, they will experience bliss. And then the last one is abhippamodayang chittang assasi samiti sikkati. Abhippamodayang chittang passasi samiti sikkati. They train such that they will breathe in, gladdening the mind, and they train such that breathing out, they will breathe out, gladdening the mind. So what's the difference between training to experience rapture, training to experience bliss, and training to gladden the mind? Well, one way to think about it is that in other places, when the Buddha is talking about the way that meditation can evolve when practiced properly, is that first someone, well, not first, but eventually someone develops piti. They develop a kind of joy, a kind of elation, a kind of rapture, euphoria, ecstasy, right? A very bubbly, positive mind state. And then from there, they experience sukha, they experience bliss, because their mind, all the suffering of their body kind of calms down, and everything, they become very still and interested and focused, and they find satisfaction, they find contentment. So out of the piti leads them into a more blissful, focused, unified state. So piti is, in a way, it's more coarse, right? When the Buddha is talking about the difference between the second and the third jhana, the difference the Buddha points out is that when someone attains the second jhana, they have both piti and sukha, both rapture and bliss. But when someone attains the third jhana, they have just sukha, just bliss, and they drop the piti, they drop the rapture. So, of course, they're all also, what the Buddha though says, right, in the first and second jhana, that they're simultaneous when someone attains those things. So in the mindfulness of breathing steps, I think that the Buddha is saying that, someone would train to experience both of them, so they would still be kind of training in a simultaneous way. But once you develop some joy, some elation, some rapture, you have to then try to find the bliss of that, the more stable bliss, which doesn't necessarily immediately erase the rapture, but you have to kind of move into the deeper levels of it, right? To kind of stabilize your mind more. And then the abhippamodayang, gladdening the mind, that point, the Buddha is actually talking about a different stage of meditation. In the first, the 5 and the 6 steps, he's talking about when someone is developing Vedananupasana, when they're contemplating Vedana, contemplating feeling or sensation, and they are developing a kind of focus on the breath, which is more refined and subtle in terms of the sensations. When he gets to this 10th step and he's talking about gladdening the mind, he's actually talking about Chittanupasana, contemplation or maybe meditation on the mind. And at that point, he's actually talking about how someone would move from just contemplating the sensations of the breath, trying to make them more refined and subtle and blissful, and instead someone then turns to examining their own mind, that which knows the breath, and trying to unify their mind together into one whole thing, rather than having a separation of like the mind and the breath being separate, but rather unifying the mind into one whole. And so then he's talking about how someone should train to gladden their mind such that their mind becomes more and more bright, more and more content in and of itself, more and more blissful in and of itself, focusing on itself. So he's talking about focusing on the mind. Whereas before, it's like he wants you to focus on the sensations that kind of evolve out of the breath. Later on, he wants you to focus on the breath kind of turning into the mind itself, gladdening the mind and trying to unify the mind. So they're kind of like, he's talking about, developing different stages of meditation. Okay, and then, yep, so almost out of time, Mary. Reminding. And Ryan, we only have a few questions left, or maybe 2 questions. So Ryan says, asking, could you speak about rains and what practitioners are supposed to do during this time and why, please? Okay, so the rains, what we call the rains, is from the Pali word davasa. It's actually kind of a very literal translation. It literally means it's referring to the monsoon season. So the rainy season, the monsoon season in India. And it's a monastic practice where monastics who are fully ordained we have rules around taking vows of stability. So often it's it's followed by most people in the monastery, but not always. I had a year as a seminary where I didn't observe the rains. But so the Buddha laid down for fully ordained monastics that they have to basically spend about 3 months of the year during the monsoon season in India. They should fix a location where they're going to stay, and they shouldn't move around to sleep and stay overnight at different places, with very rare exceptions. And so what are you supposed to do? Well, you're supposed to be stable. You're supposed to be developing just that kind of practice, and it can really vary. Some monasteries, they do a meditation retreat. Some monasteries, they become more social, and there's different things that go on, but it's a monastic practice. Often what lay people will do, as well as monastics, but what's very common, sometimes I've heard the rains called the Buddhist Lent. Buddhist people sometimes say Buddhist Lent. Like I've heard Burmese people especially call it that. Because it's very common for monastics as well as lay people to take extra vows, make extra adhitthana, extra determinations. So maybe you determine for the rains retreat, you're going to follow all the 5 precepts if you haven't been following all 5. Or if you have been following all 5, maybe you determine that you're going to start following the 8 precepts once a week. Or if you've already been doing that, you're going to start following the 8 precepts for the whole rains retreat, maybe. Or you're going to do more meditation. Or you're going to do more sutta study. Or you're going to do more chanting. Or you're going to go to the monastery and offer more dana or something like that. So you basically make an adhitthana, a determination to increase your practice to some extent. And for monastics, often they'll do something like that. So they might determine to do one of those things, obviously not the 8 precepts or whatever, because that's, monastics are already following those more than those. But they might make a determination to do more meditation or more study or more chanting, or they might make a determination to follow one of the ascetic practices. So like not laying down, just doing the sitting posture, the sitting, standing, and walking posture, but not laying down, or fasting, or restrictions around food, or some other kind of restriction, some other ascetic practice. So often it'll be some kind of increase in your determination, increase in your practice. So that's very common. And I would recommend you use it like that, right? That's a skillful way of doing it. Although the Buddha didn't, say that that's obligatory or something. It's just become a tradition. And then Ryan says, finally, our last question about Air India. You were struck from seeing this man's karma in action before our own eyes. There's no other explanation, is there? Well, Ryan, I'm, glad that you're trying to find the Dhamma and different things that you experience. Okay, friends. So thank you for joining. Thank you for listening and your enthusiasm. It's always wonderful to think that, there are people in this world who want to spend their Friday night thinking about the Dhamma, listening to the Dhamma, rather than watching the Super Bowl or whatever's going on right now. I don't know. So it's really, wonderful. And I hope that your practice goes well, that you are well, happy, peaceful, wherever you are and whenever you are watching this. And so we will see you for any future live streams and programs at the monastery.